What do you think when you think Irish whiskey? What's up, guys? This is Chris, and you are listening to Whiskey Noobs. And the reason I ask what you think of when you think Irish whiskey is because in this episode, I talk a good bit about that with my guest. We talk about how a lot of people tend to think of Jameson and these very sweet, very light flavors that some Irish whiskeys can give you that to some people are honestly considered a little bit boring. My guest, Darryl McNally from Limavady Irish Whiskey, talks about how he doesn't like the boring flavors and he wanted to redefine what people thought of when they thought Irish whiskey. If you want to hear what he came up with and how it is different from other Irish whiskeys, well, you're just going to have to listen to this interview. So without further ado, I will cut to that interview with Darryl McNally from Limavady Irish Whiskey right now. And I'll start you off with a really easy one. I ask pretty much all of my guests, how did you fall in love with whiskey? Where did it begin?
It's quite amazing that. So I always tell the story. Well, I started whiskey 24 years ago, 1998 at Bushmills. But I believe I'm 48 years old. So when I was born, literally born out of my mother, I came to the family Irish bar. So I was brought up in an Irish bar. So I can remember at a very, very young age packing shelves and pouring pints of Guinness and knowing, the different liquids, the spirits, clear liquid, usually vodka, gin. Then we had Scotch whiskies and Irish whiskey. So yeah, I suppose you got to learn it at a very, very young age. So it was no surprise whatsoever that after university, I said to my mum and dad, hey, guess what? I've got a job at Bushmills. So, and I started in Bushmills. This is interesting because my primary degree was in accountancy and corporate financial management. Although I did the sciences at grammar school, I was thinking of doing medicine or something like that. So it always was sort of in the science arena. But at the last minute, I decided to do something like business, which accountancy and corporate financial management, because nobody really knows what they want to do at 18. So I thought this will give me another 3 or 4 years to sort of think, what do I want to get into? And I just was lucky. I got a job at Bushmills looking after the procurement and purchasing from my primary degree. And then I just got bitten by the bug of how the process was made. I suppose it was that scientific mind that I had. Oh, how is this made? What way does it work? How do you convert the sugars? How do you convert sugars to alcohols? What this is amazing. But I remember at 15 or 16, we did fermentation as part of our chemistry, module. And I remember that just been fascinating. And it was interesting because I actually went back to my old school when I worked at Bushmills and taught them fermentation for that 5th year exam way back. So that was pretty cool. So yeah, bitten by the bug at a young age, being born in a bar. But then also once I went to Bushmills, I just was intrigued about how the process of making whiskey. And I suppose that was it. But when I started to become or trained to be master distiller, there never was one day where you didn't want to go in because you were just fascinated to learn. And then it was sort of 7 years of learning before you can be officially called a master distiller. And even before I left Bushmills, or before I left Dublin Liberty's distillery with a fully working distillery, you're still learning every day. Every day is a new day. So you're always learning little things, even, haven't been in the trade or haven't been in the business for 24 years.
Yeah, it's a whiskey in general is a culture that you could just learn about forever, and I don't think you could ever learn all of it. I don't think anybody could. It's fascinating. And I think part of that is actually something you hinted at, and that is that it is where the science, the chemistry, and the art form meet. And I find that it really brings people together from both those sides of the aisle. And I think a lot of the people that I've met through the podcast and the social media channels, a lot of them have what you mentioned, where there's an interest in the science. And then so the science-based folks were interested in it because it's science-based. And I have a degree in engineering, so I'm very science-based. And we're interested in the science behind it. And then there's the added appeal that there's this art form, where if you're very scientific, you don't fully get it, and that kind of makes it attractive. And then you want to learn more about that side of it. And I think the flip-flop goes for the more artistic people that makes it interesting to them as well. And I find that really is that what you would say your experience has been throughout your learning process at Bushmills?
Yeah, absolutely. With Bushmills, it was always sort of triple distilled single malt, so that's why Limavady's I'm very much a malt purist. But I have some fascinating conversations, with the pot still, mix of malted and unmalted barley with my friends down in Irish distillers. But also when I worked for Diageo, there was 26 or 27 malt distilleries, but 26 of them, all of them except one was in Scotland. So I got then to have the conversations with master distillers in Scotland who all worked for Diageo. So again, that was a triple distill versus double distill. Then you go to, the American side of things, how that's done, and then the double distillation versus triple distillation, the mash bills. There's so many fascinating different factors that gives different taste profiles. And then there's the age-old question: how much does distillation bring to your whiskey versus maturation, versus the blending versus the casks versus the quality of the casks? And then there's that little bit that nobody mentions, which is the yeast. What about the yeast? What about fermentation times? All that good stuff. So you could never stop wondering of what if you did that a little bit less or a little bit more? How would that affect that? What if you put it into the still a bit more fiery? What way would that come off? What if you did your cuts a little bit different? So there's this fascinating world of innovation even now, in the age-old tradition of making whiskey, which I just, every day is a learning day.
Yeah. So that actually brings up a great point that I was curious about. So between, your experience at Bushmills, you've clearly been in the distillation game for quite a while. And especially for some of my listeners who a lot of my listeners deal with bourbon, being that I'm just based in the U.S. And a lot of times I think it can be seen as, how can you stand out as a single malt, given that it's all using the same grain? And you hinted at a lot of those knobs that you can turn. How would you say, if you had to kind of summarize the Limavady, the way that you stand out? And I think we'll get to the single barrel as well, which is another important point.
Sure.
But some of those other factors you mentioned, how do they weigh into your decisions when you're blending, or not blending, but formulating a new whiskey?
Sure. Well, when I worked at Bushmills, Bushmills had blended whiskey, mix of malted and unmalted barley, or not malted and grain whiskey. So, we had that in the sort of introduction side, or the lower end of the markets, and then you had your 10-year-old malt, your 12-year-old malt, 16, 21. And that really tapped in a bit to the Scotch market, where it was older malts and finish with a finish. But Limavady, I always sort of kept it up my sleeve that I believed you nearly needed to engineer, a price point to start with. That, what would a consumer pay? What is the ideal price for, the world to try and taste this, if this makes sense? And from that, I said, there's no reason you wouldn't put a 3-year-old malt into a PX finish, but a 4.5 to 5-year-old malt, it's long enough in bourbon cask to give a finish into something else. So with Limavady, the points of difference for me was I always use first fill bourbon cask, so it's 100% hit of fresh bourbon cask. I then sell them on to other distilleries, because generally in Scotland and Ireland you'll use a mix of first fill bourbon, second fill bourbon, third fill bourbon. Sometimes in Scotland you use it a fourth or fifth time. So you have a mix of whiskey that's coming out of bourbon cask with a level and degree of concentration, if that makes sense. With the first fill obviously more concentrated. So with Limavady I wanted 4.5, 5 years of full bourbon concentration. To me, then that made it a like the same tasting age of, say, a 7 or 8 or 9-year-old with a mix of bourbon for second, third fill, and then I flicked it into a PX for a finish. So therefore, you had a younger whiskey going into a PX finish, which was never really seen before, and then that gave that element of 7, 8, 9 years in bourbon, but into PX, but maybe the total age is only 5 years old. So you were almost concentrating the taste profile, which in Limavady, when people taste it, you see them going, this has to be a 12-year-old. No, it's not a 12-year-old. It's what? A 5-year-old. People go, this does not taste like a 5-year-old because there's just too many flavors. It's too concentrated. But that's what I wanted to do, bring out the malt purist, concentrated with bourbon cask, finished at a very young age. There's very few malts out there finished in Pedro Jimenez at 4.5, 5 years old. So this is completely new. And Limavady has owned that, if you like, and has made that its own. And then, as you quite rightly said, we have the single barrel, aspect where we bottle off PX cask finish, 4 to 6 months, we bottle that off individually. So you have slight differences between, one cask and the next, but not too much of a difference whereby people would go, oh my God, that doesn't taste like the Limavady that I tasted 3 months ago, if that makes sense. It's close enough, but it's not this close. It's sort of this close, but close enough.
Right. Wow. That is actually very interesting. So I appreciate that detail with the finishing process, because so to break it down a little bit for some of the folks listening, especially the newer folks. So what you're saying is that a lot of times you'll have a whiskey that has been aged. They'll age it in a bourbon barrel, but that doesn't mean, and I think a lot of people make this assumption, that doesn't mean you dump the bourbon out, you sell it, you put in whiskey. It could be you put in whiskey, you dump that whiskey out, you put in more, and you dump that out, and then you put in more. And so that's
Several cycles.
that's a fascinating detail to think about, because what you're saying is we want first fill, the bourbon leaves it, we put our whiskey in it. We're going to get stronger flavors from that right off the rip. And then it's still going to be younger because I got those strong flavors from that first fill, and then I can put it into the PX casks and do something a little bit different with having a younger whiskey in those casks.
Correct.
That and is absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then in turn you can price it with Limavady sort of just below the $50 mark, so it doesn't need to be 70, 80, $90 because of the age and losses and all that good stuff. So it's almost like creating an Irish whiskey on steroids, if that makes sense in some crazy way, giving it the best opportunity with the best casks, the freshest casks, and taking it from there.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. I don't think that's something that I think a lot of people can tend to overlook, especially the first use, second use barrel. And then on top of that, I don't think a lot of people realize how drastically age could affect the price point, because you're storing this whiskey and not making any money off of it while it's sitting there. So like you said, with picking that price point and saying, how do I sort of engineer in essence this whiskey around that price point, and bring that flavor, I think that's a creative approach to doing that, by using those first fills and doing the kind of double finish, the bourbon and then the PX. That's very intriguing. So one thing that I wanted to clarify, because I know that it is more common across the pond for sure, is with sourcing. It sounds like is all of your whiskey is distilled, or some of it sourced, or how does that work?
Yeah, well, I'm one of 3 master distillers in Ireland now. There's a lot of distilleries that have been built recently. So I suppose that there's a lot of the new Irish whiskies that are out there are all sourced, because even brands that have their own distillery, it's taken them 4, 5, 6 years of production to get to use their own liquid. So, when you say sourced in Ireland at the minute, almost all the liquid is sourced other than from 3 distilleries, if that makes sense. So Limavady sourced, but I knew where to look and knew what sort of quality I was looking for. Believe it or not, I would have helped a lot of people during the process of getting their distilleries up and running, and have a really good relationship with lots of operational people. So I knew where all the good liquid was, if that makes sense. So I was able to source exactly what I was looking for. Then, if you can imagine, I pick up the PX. I deal directly with the cask company on the PX barrels. It's a company I've dealt with for 22 years. So I know I'm getting the top quality cask there. So if you can imagine, you are sourcing liquid, but you're taking it at a very early stage from the distillery, and then you're nurturing it the whole way through. We are over here. It's very difficult to get planning permission. I've been looking for planning permission for a distillery for about 6 years. I'm very close now, touch wood, that we get some approvals very soon. So our game would be to have our own distillery, but again, we'll still have to source liquid for essentially to rebuild the distillery plus 5 years almost, because the age of Limavady is roughly 5 years. So you will be sourcing liquid for the foreseeable future until such time that you have your distillery up and running. So that's something quite new in Ireland, because we only had the 3 distilleries who were obviously functioning distilleries, and they were putting out their liquid. And the renaissance of Irish whiskey in the last 3, 4, 5 years, there's been a lot of brands out there who have sourced their liquid and got sort of into the market sooner, then maybe started to build a distillery thereafter, and have finished building their distillery now and are on the transition to their own liquid over a period of time. But Limavady, we pick it up at an early age, put it like that, and we nurture it then right through on exactly what we want. So it's sourcing, but not full sourcing. Full sourcing, I say some brands will just buy generic liquid and just put it into a bottle, whereas I'm taking liquid that I've sourced and taking a PX finish and making sure it's got that length of time. So honing all my skills as a master distiller to make Limavady what I wanted to be, very much on paper. And then we took it through the process, and we were very happy with the outcome.
Yes, I should have clarified that that is what I was getting at is the barreling process, the aging process. You're doing all of that, whereas
Correct.
in the States, and I'm sure this happens everywhere, but we've had some issues with companies that were just bottling something and trying to pass it as they were the ones who've been making this for years. And that's very different. The sourcing culture is much stronger with Irish whiskey and with Scotch whiskey. That's part of the process is understanding how to source your whiskey, not just buying anything and
Anything.
throwing right. And that comes with the, I'm sure, the experience of being a master distiller. Doesn't hinder you in any way from picking the right distillate to to age. Yeah. Okay. So I've mentioned before on my show something about Irish whiskey. Speaking of the culture behind Irish whiskey, that it seems to me, because I always really enjoyed the Irish whiskeys that I have tried, and it always seemed to me like it gets overlooked on occasion in the United States whiskey culture. And I think that's because some people just don't know what to expect. They haven't, it's kind of a self-feeding problem where you don't know what to expect, so you don't try it and you don't find out. So my question for you would be, if you had to elevator pitch Irish whiskey to somebody who's been more familiar with the bourbon and the Scotch, what would you say to them?
Yeah, well, for years I always thought that Irish whiskey was beginning to become very light. Very, very, how would you say, it doesn't stack up in cocktails. It's very light. It's always at the 40%. It's always 80 proof. Um, it was quite generic, and like Jameson, you can't argue with Jameson. Jameson's like phenomenon, really, like 12 million cases. You can't argue with that. Jameson almost became, and I'm sure my friends at Irish distillers won't mind me saying it, almost like a category within the Irish whiskey category, because it became something that people would have had a shoot, drink. Jameson was like a household name, and still does that. What I wanted to do was to bring back what I believe the old Irish whiskey should be, which was something which was huge in the US in the early 1900s, before the Prohibition, before the Irish Civil War, before there was an embargo put an export of Irish whiskey into the US, and then Scotch sort of took over because there was no Irish whiskey coming in. So Irish sort of died a death, if you like, in the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, Irish whiskey was selling 14 million cases. We're only getting back to 14 million cases essentially in 2022. So we're only getting back to where we were way back then. So this is only the start of the journey, I believe. And with all the different tasting Irish whiskies now, different to Jameson. And again, I'm caveating, you can't argue with Jameson with 12 million cases. What I want to do is bring out triple distilled Irish single malt. I wanted 100% malted barley. I wanted to do a finish. I wanted a single barrel. So all these, super premium ticks, if you like, and giving Limavady its own style. Taking the Limavady dates back to 1750. There was an article here that I found from 1815, and it said Limavady malt whiskey, and it said Jameson whiskey. Jameson spelled with an I, actually, but it's still Jameson whiskey because Jameson formed in 1780, Limavady formed in 1750. So I wanted to keep that malt purism, if you like, which is much more, maybe not so much malt. American malts are slowly coming back, but the bourbons, your eyes, and so on and so forth. So something more full-bodied, something that would make a Scotch drinker or an American whiskey drinker, bourbon rye, jump up and go, "Oh, this isn't Irish. This is too strong for Irish." And I think with Limavady, and I know you're tasting it there, you're getting the maltiness, you're getting the 92 proof, you're getting the vanilla, you're getting the spiciness from the bourbon cast, and then you're getting this lovely PX dark summer fruit sort of flavor coming from it. So it doesn't taste like an Irish. And I love blind tasting with people, and they start to go, "Is that a Japanese whiskey? Can't be an Irish. No, can't be an Irish." And when you start to drill down, well, what does an Irish mean to you? If they said it's much lighter in taste, with Limavady, I want to sort of flick that trend and make Limavady what it was a way back then, what it tasted like a way back then, and to bring that sort of 100% malt back to life again.
Yeah, and I think a spoiler to the tasting notes I'm going to give here in a bit is you've succeeded at that. I mean, it does have the body that I think that's a great way to put it to the bourbon drinker, is this is not going to have the very mellow kind of just whiskey taste minus the punch. This has a little bit of that punch to it. And I will, like I said, I wrote down a couple notes, and I'll talk about that. And I am drinking it as we speak.
Sure,
So,
sure. Uh-huh.
so that is a great way, I think, of putting that. And I think you bring up a good point about like Jameson and how much they put through, and how that has distorted our way of thinking about Irish whiskey. And I find that even with other Irish whiskey brands, you can, if you branch out, you can find that they don't all taste like Jameson. I mean, I'd say no whiskey tastes exactly the same, but I think people expect that, and I think that's a great elevator pitch to those who do expect that. Is that's not always the case.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but this Limavady is the first single barrel Irish whiskey. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, yeah. So there was a few single casks would have been done back in the day. I remember at Bushmills we'd have done, we'd have done cask strength rum or bourbon or sherry, but it might only have been maybe 5 or 6 casks of each as a one-off bottling. I remember going to Germany and going to the US, and I've been in a few of the big whiskey bars in the US, and sort of were pulling down bottles. Do you remember this one? I go, yeah, I remember it really well. There was 4 casks of that, and you're so lucky to have a bottle. It actually was in a place I'll not mention it, but he brought out a bottle, and we had about this much in, and we finished it. It was just so refreshing to take you back to maybe 15 years ago where you were making this particular whiskey. But no, it was only a very one-off. So with Limavady, I wanted, and especially with Whistlepig and what, how big they are with their single casks, and that offering that they give to people as a one-off, buying bespoke casks and cask picks and things like that. I believe that the consumer in the US in particular love that sort of notion of something that's a one-off. It's bespoke. It comes from a particular cask. I also believe they like it at a higher strength. So we've done some Limavady Founders casks, which we'd kept from the first bottling, and we did them at full strength as well. So it was a cask strength. So they were coming off about 108 or 109 proof. So we do sell them in some markets in the US, as a Founders cask, as a one-off. And it was amazing some of the tastings that you do that, between, say, the 92, which is the Limavady normal, versus 108 or 109. The amount of feedback that I got, oh my God, this Founders cask at 109 still tastes no burn. With Limavady, there's no burn going down into your stomach. It's just very refreshing. They said, we can't believe we've never tasted anything like this that's so hot, at a higher strength. So I think we're doing something right there with bringing what the US consumer wants. And let's face it, I want Limavady to be a success in the US. That's first and foremost. We're going into other markets, but the US is where we want to be first and foremost. So we're in 30 states there now. So we've had a very busy 15 months. So I'm glad that we got it all rolled out in those 30 states, and now we can nurture it through on various other types of casks in the future. But we want to get Limavady as it is, very much, the main SKU, if you want, and then use the single barrel thing for new expressions in the future, with some maybe weird and wonderful cash. Watch this space.
Okay. Yeah, and so I actually have a question about that then. So with doing the single barrel style, I've always been curious about this. I've never had the chance to ask a master distiller about it.
Sure.
So let's say you come across like a barrel. There's always the honey barrel that you find, and it's wonderful. And I think that's actually what led to single barrel bourbon initially, was the idea. What if we just sold the honey barrel? What typically happens? Let's say you find a barrel that is just doesn't have the palate that you'd want it to have,
Sure.
It's just not measuring up. What happens in that scenario typically?
To be honest, you never find anything that's off, if you like, or substandard, for want of a better word. You always find something where you go, that maybe needs a little bit longer, within the PX cast, for example, or you might set it aside and say, let's leave that for something special for the future. But if you're dealing with the correct barrel supplier, i.e. the Pedro Jimenez PX supplier in Jerez in southern Spain, that's a company who does everything right. They actually cooper the barrel from scratch. They make up the barrel. They season it for the 2.5 years. So if you're dealing with good suppliers like that, I can sleep in my bed at night knowing that the quality of those casks are going to be very, very similar. And I found that to date that there is the odd cask that's, this is perfect here. But I think the difference between some of the casks being a little bit more of the spicy vanilla, which is more the bourbon influence coming through, and a little bit of PX, versus then those really sweet ones where the PX flavors has been really coming through. Maybe we left them a month longer than we should have, maybe give a little bit of a nuance between one and the other. But I think that's half the fun of it. I think that's, there's already been a buzz. Oh my God, cask 35 was amazing. 37 was great. 57 was amazing. But oh my God, I tasted 65 the other day and it was just, heaven. I think that's whiskey should be. It should be a bit of fun. It should be a bit of, calling up your mates. Can you get me a couple of bottles of that cask 47 that's only can be found in Florida? Yeah, sure. And that's already beginning to happen in some places, which I think that's half the fun of it. And then you have people, because the bottles are numbered, you have people coming and going, oh, I would love to get bottle number 1 of that, or could I a certain number from the bottles, if you like, because it's a large PX cask, so there's 846 bottles in every barrel, if that makes sense. So people are looking for special numbers as well and special cask numbers. So I just think it adds to the whole premiumness of Limavady. And like I always say, whiskey should be enjoyed. There should be a bit of a laugh, a bit of fun about it. I think that's what Limavady brings.
Yeah, I think you summarized that great. I couldn't agree more that that is the discovery of whiskey is the point. I've told this to family members on multiple occasions who have bought me bottles, and I don't know if I should buy you this one. What if you don't like it? That's the point. Maybe it's not my palate, but the exploration is what's so much fun.
Yeah.
That's what so many of us live for. And you see that growing with the single barrels like you just mentioned. Oh, I would love to get this cask. You see that happening with other brands with batches. Oh, this batch is better than the last one. So it adds a whole other level to the, well, have you tried this brand? You've tried this brand. Have you tried this cask? That's a whole, it's interesting to learn and to experience, and it keeps the hunt enjoyable.
And I think as well, if somebody's talking about that as well, and they're talking about Limavady and they're talking about all the different options you have, then I always say if people are talking about your brand, then that's good, because people then get introduced to it. And I feel once you get a try of Limavady, it's almost sips and lips sort of thing. That once you try it, whoa, I like this. Where some people are sometimes reluctant to try something new. Some people, which you'll agree, American consumers who maybe love bourbon are going to be very reluctant maybe to try Irish. So with Limavady, I'm trying to, let's just taste it and see how it goes. I went to a rock and rye festival in the Mammoth Mountains there when I went over to the US in September, and it was very much a rye and bourbon, American consumer. And the amount of people that come up and tasted Limavady thinking, oh, is this a new bourbon? Not knowing it was an Irish, because I sort of try and keep that a little bit of a secret sort of until the tail end. The amount of people would give Limavady, oh my God, this is unbelievable. We love it. And scratching their heads and going, you've converted me here. You've converted me. And I'm going, listen, there's a time for bourbon, there's a time for rye, and there's a time for Limavady Irish. So depend on what you need or what you want.
Yes, regardless of the brand, because I'm not just saying this because I have you on camera right now, but regardless of the brand, I cannot agree more that there's this almost stubbornness to stick with bourbon that I have experienced with my own friends, and I've had them try something, and there's a culture, especially with folks who don't know as much about whiskey, that we just kind of call things bourbon, almost like some people call all sodas Coke because of the brand of Coke. And I've had people say, well, what bourbon is that? And I said, well, you're drinking a Scotch or you're drinking an Irish right now. And I have been a huge proponent. Anybody listening right now would know this as well if you've been listening for a while, is I've been a huge proponent of try multiple different kinds.
Mm-hmm.
Too many people they'll hear that barrel-proof bourbon is like the best, and they're brand new to whiskey, and then it just fries their palate, and then they stop, and they say, well, I must not like whiskey.
Yeah.
You've got to try it all. You've got to try it all. That's for sure.
And I always say to people, you sometimes drink with your peers or your colleagues drink or your work colleagues drink, and you're trying this whiskey hoping that you'll like it, and you see people sort of grimacing as they taste it. And I always say, well, listen, if you ate some food and as you were eating the food and you went, would you go back to it? And you go, no. But there will be something there for you. I would say, it's not that you're some sort of person that doesn't like whiskey. Exactly what you say. You need to try other types of whiskey. And there's no right or wrong for your palate. Just try it and you will find something, and that'll be your go-to whiskey for the rest of your life. Be different. Take a leap of faith, just like Limavady. Try something different and you'll love it. So.
Absolutely. Yes. That is, I always try to just put that forward. So when you mentioned that, I wanted to really drive that home for my listeners because I love that. You can't just be stuck on the one type. And yeah, that's great. So speaking of which, speaking of the profile of Limavady, I did jot down a couple notes. I wanted to talk about it, give a quick review. A lot of my listeners are used to listening to me review, so they know the type of notes that I say and what I'm thinking when I say those things. I think starting off, what I normally would do when I have guests who are newer than me is I let them to say the notes, and then I will follow up with what I think since I have a bit more experience. Since this is your whiskey, I think
Yeah.
I'll give some of my thoughts, and I'd like your opinion. And as we mentioned, don't bother or don't worry to disagree with me because everybody's palate is different. So I am drinking some right now, and this one is 46% alcohol by volume or 92 proof. Ironically enough, I didn't even realize that until you mentioned the proof, because you're right that it doesn't have the gut burn to it. Very easy to sip, very oily on the palate, and it gives me really good. I was trying to nail some of it down because some of it it does have, it's a little bit more splashy than a different Irish, and so it took me some time to nail down what I think really makes the splash the most on my palate. So you've got the good sweetness that you would expect from something malty, the honey type of sweetness for me. And then I think I get some splash, some little standout is a little bit of like an orangey citrus, and then herbal notes that I wouldn't normally expect that are almost, I don't know how to explain it, but some sort of an herbal note that I don't know if I have fully nailed down that really, to me, puts it a bit aside from other Irish whiskeys that I've had. Normally, I'll get just like the sweet honey and maybe like granola.
Sure.
So that's where I'm landing is to bring up some other ones that I guess would give me similar experiences to not just having that granola. I know, for example, like Redbreast 12 year gives me more of like a floral type
Sure.
fruitiness. And this has got that kind of a thing going on. It's got this herbal, maybe a little bit fruity, like I said, that citrus, and a little bit more pop. So how did I do? What do you think?
No, well, I think as well as sometimes when I was saying about the age as well, the age brings, the younger age when you're talking to your Limavady's 5 years versus a 12-year-old Redbreast. Redbreast is a mix of malted and unmalted barley. So the unmalted barley will bring you more sort of the grassy, fruity, flavors from that. With Limavady, you're getting 100% of the malt. So you're getting that real, as you said, the granola, the maltiness, the oatmeal, that sort of oaty sort of flavor from it, from the malt. But then you're getting hit with, the first full bourbon cast, which is that spicy vanilla, almost on your tongue, almost like, I always say it's like somebody put a little bit of chili in your tongue, but in a nice way. Like, and then your second sip, after you've sort of cleansed your palate, the spice starts to die down. You get more of the maltiness and more of that then PX coming through. The PX is, the sweetest sherry that you can get. So it really does do a job on whiskey, when you put it in as a finish. But you need to be careful that you don't overdo it with the PX, because a lot of people will maybe leave PX finish for 12 months or 18 months, and all of a sudden you've lost all of the bourbon flavors, which I didn't want to do. I wanted to get that nice mix of the spice, the vanilla, and I think that's what you get sort of in the tongue. And then after you've cleansed, you get that PX, which brings in that dark summer fruits, dark chocolate almost, and bringing it in very, very, very quickly. And then you sort of start to dispel the spiciness as you go through it. You still have 92 proof there, so you have the 92 proof as well that's playing away in the background, because it's not a 12-year-old, it's a 5-year-old. So you have the, not saying that it's young at 5-year-old, but it's younger than a 12-year-old. So you get that pop that you're talking about. Whoa, it's a 5-year-old, it's not a 12-year-old. But then it's sort of masked very quickly with that spicy vanilla and then the summer fruits coming through. And then you have the 92 proof, which there's not a lot of whiskeys, Irish whiskeys out there at 92 proof. So people aren't used to that either. So that's something that sort of hits them. If you were to add a little bit of water to Limavady to take it down to, say, 40%, 80 proof, you're going to get a lot more of those floral, fruity notes coming through that you'll get, say, in Redbreast. And by the way, comparing it to Redbreast, a compliment, because that's, it's one of the Irish whiskies that I really do think is phenomenal. So, and it's interesting because the casks that they use for redbreast, the finish and things come from the same supplier as I get my casks from Limavady, because I worked for Irish distillers back in the day. So I would have very much sourced, those sort of barrels, and how would you say, in whiskey, you never change things that aren't broken. So those suppliers in Jerez are phenomenal suppliers. They're the best of the best. So for me to get my casks for Limavady from them, it just shows Limavady is very super premium. We only want the best of the best, and it's a nice keeping with redbreast. I would live with that all day long. I always say to people, redbreast is the pot still, version of Limavady, and vice versa. I went for the full malt, with a PX finish. Redbreast is very much, mix of malted and unmalted barley, very much the Irish distiller's way, but a great whiskey. And with Limavady, I wanted to make, the malt purist and, a younger liquid that has a PX finish, which you're describing. So all those flavor profiles have got a reason behind them, and you've had a lot of them, to be fair to you.
Yeah, yeah. And when you said dark chocolate, that's a good one that I missed. That is for sure there, right? For me, it's a little bit towards the end, as that grainy and honey and what did you mention? The spiciness from the oak. I would almost call I've called it in the past like a black pepper. Yes,
we said it at the same time. Pepper.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you get that on the tongue a little bit, and that dark chocolate's a great point that I missed. I like that.
I remember years ago when I did some whiskey tastings, I would have put out dark chocolate, for a little nibble. People would have took a little bit of chocolate, and I say, right, now try the whiskey. Do you see what I mean? Now try a little bit of the dark chocolate. I'd even leave out little bits of chili so that you can actually taste the chili. That is a lot of descriptors that people don't use. When I say spicy, it's almost like pepper, as you say, pepper in the tongue, but not in a bad way. It's just peppery, spicy, vanilla, all those flavors that bourbon cask bring out. And then you have the PX just to come in at the end, almost like your dessert. At the tail end, dark chocolate. Sure, that's perfect. Works well with chili. Yeah, and that's why I think it's such a balanced whiskey, and a whiskey that, has so many flavors going through. A lot of people say it's very complex, but it's just because of the flavors from those two different cask types, which brings that out. And then the 92 proof at the back end just sort of throws that all into a bit of a whirlwind, if you like, and that's why you're getting all those flavors.
Yeah. All of that follows for me. I definitely think everything you described there, it definitely has that little bit of a punch that keeps it from definitely keeps it from being boring, is what I'm trying to say. And the other point that you brought up that, just from doing one tasting we wouldn't see, but that makes it interesting, is when you try a different barrel, now you're going to have a slightly different experience. And that's can be very helpful for folks who don't quite know what's the PX going to give it, what's the bourbon going to give it. By comparing two, you might see, this one has more of those bourbon barrel notes, this one has more of those PX notes.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's a colleague of mine's, Blaine Adams, and Blaine he works with Whistlepig Limavady. He's one of the educators for the Whistlepig team and Limavady teams. And he's made it his life to pick all the different bottles from different casks, and really goes into it, and maybe more than I do sometimes, because I don't have time. I sort of have it wrote down and then travel, but he's come back, you have to try 35, you have to try 57. When we were up in the Mammoth Mountains, we had 6 different types of casks, and we put it out to the people on Meet the Maker, and people were going, oh my God, you're so right, because it was very difficult to convince people that one cask will be slightly different. But if you take them through a tasting of 5 different casks at Limavady, people go, oh my God. And then I always say, which one's your favorite? And you'll have those people who love the spicy, peppery vanilla. You'll have those people who love the PX. They'll pick accordingly, and I'll get a show of hands. And it's amazing just how many varieties of whiskey tasters have different favorites across those 5 casks. So,
yes,
I enjoy the fun. That's part of the fun.
That's definitely the fun. Absolutely. So yeah, to wrap up my thoughts on the flavor profile, I would agree with what you said. I think you get that little bit of black pepper. The sweetness to me is like a honey, which, like you said, from that maltiness, that honey grainy sweetness. but it just doesn't stop there. You definitely get this fruitiness. I threw out, I think, like citrus, almost like orange to me, and then dark chocolate that you mentioned, and with more of the PX, you said like the dark fruits, which I wouldn't say that I caught necessarily on this one, but that could just be my palate. That dark
Yeah.
chocolate with that citrus is definitely what I'm picking up, and those bourbon barrel notes, for sure.
And now I've converted quite a few people to an old fashioned. You know the way the old fashions get that orange sort of citrus flavor. So in the US, we went to Vegas, and the nine fine Irishmen have put Limavady as their base for an old fashioned in their bar, which is amazing. But it's amazing how much the orange citrus is pulled out of Limavady. So I had a little smile when you said that, because that was one I purposely left out. But another one I get is butterscotch, like Werther's, a little bit of that butterscotch coming as
Yes.
well, which is very interesting. So that was one I was leaving to the end to see if you got it. But have another little try there, and I guarantee you get that Werther's original when it sort of dries out the butterscotch, sort of feeling to it, and almost the oiliness within your mouth as well that a Werther's original brings out. So that's another one that I would use from time to time.
Yeah, I could see that as well, and the oiliness, as you mentioned, is absolutely there. And I should add, I didn't really talk much about the finish, but the finish, you can still feel it there, not in a I have cotton balls in my mouth type of way, but in the oil coated my mouth, and now I can still taste it. Yeah. Yeah, so to wrap up, I do have a couple more questions that I just wanted to run through here. So, would you say, well, I actually, one of the questions that I had planned, I think we already touched on. So I was going to ask, would you say most of the barrels you pick are similar, or do some stand out? And I think we've covered, which is what I wanted to get at, that you get a variety when you're trying different barrels with a single barrel whiskey.
Correct. Yeah.
So then the last thing that I want to just touch on before we wrap up here is, if people listen to this and they want to try your product, I know you mentioned 30 states for your distribution, but I don't want to ask you to necessarily rattle off all 30. But what does the current distribution look like? I know you mentioned you're working with Whistle Pig on it, and how can people go about finding Limavady?
Sure, yeah, yeah. Well, if you go onto the website, we installed an addition onto the website. I think it was maybe last weekend or 2 weekends ago, where you can find your store in the US. So that's very good. So you can find your local store. It's in 30 states in the US now. And I would say the 30 states maybe makes up 85% of Irish whiskey drinkers, or indeed whiskey drinkers, perhaps, maybe for want of a better word. So I think the first protocol would go on to the Limavady Irish Whiskey website. There's a part that we can find your local store, and if that fails, if it's not launched in your state, you can go to Caskers as well, who can deliver. But as I say, if you ever have any problems, find it, by all means, please just leave a little message on the website, and we'll be back to you ASAP, because we would hate for people not to get a chance to try it.
Great. Yeah, I think that's super helpful. God bless the internet that we can just look it up, we can put in our zip code, and we can know where we can find it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And as I say, Limavady as well. Some things we didn't touch on. Limavady, dates back to 1750, so it's not a new kid in the block. It's essentially me bringing the whiskey back to life. It's where I'm born and bred. I'm sitting in Limavady here as I talk to you. It's Irish for leap of the dog, so it's a story of an Irish wolfhound that jumped the River Roe to warn its master about an enemy ambush and saved the town, and then the town was named after it. But the reason Limavady tugged on my heartstrings so much, why I went on a crusade, if you like, of building distilleries, but couldn't really settle until I got Limavady launched, is because my family owned it in 1880. So I have a real family link. My brother's a distiller. He worked in Bushmills as well. There's only the two of us. So I think there was sort of the DNA of making whiskey was running through your veins for many, many years, sort of handed down generation after generation. So I was almost getting haunted at night by my relatives, bring back Limavady, bring it back to life. So yeah, Limavady was very much tugging at the heartstrings, and then to have Whistlepig as a partner to help me and help with distribution, etc. That's a dream partner to have. So we think the same, and I think our mantra is like whiskey's about having fun, which we touched on. Once you stop having fun, what's the point? So I just that you can bring out the passion within the taste of the whiskey, and there'll be lots more of other iterations hopefully coming next year and the year after, which I would be love to come back on again and take you through some of the R&D and some of the projects we have coming through. But it'll be very much single barrel at heart, and all those sort of weird and wonderful tastes that we want, and more bold tastes that we want from Limavady moving forward. So watch this space.
For sure, and the more I learn, the more I'm interested. This hour has flown by, so I appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me. It has been an absolute pleasure.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Whiskey Noobs. If you like the show, please make sure to leave a 5-star rating or review to help grow the show and get the word out. You can also find more Whiskey Noobs content on Instagram at whiskey_noobs and on TikTok at Whiskey Noobs Podcast. If you want to drink right along with me, make sure to join the email list by sending an email to whiskeynoobspodcast@gmail.com with a subject line saying email list. You will receive monthly emails with a list of the whiskeys that will be featured throughout the month so that you can buy them ahead of time and drink right along with the show. Once again, thanks for listening to this episode. The Whiskey Noobs Podcast does not support underage or otherwise irresponsible consumption of alcohol.